The group gathered around it is not enthusiastic. Two people have already stepped back. One older woman is gesturing in a way that, across any language barrier, clearly means throw it out. But one person, and this is the part that matters, one person is still leaning forward. Not because they're reckless, and not because they're stupid. Because something about the smell, underneath the sourness and the wrongness, is registering as familiar. Fruity. Dense. The kind of olfactory signal that, in 10 million years of primate wiring, has been associated with calories, with ripeness, with something worth the risk of closer investigation. They reach in. They taste it. And their face does something complicated. That complicated expression, the one caught between disgust and something else entirely, something that doesn't have a name yet, is where the whole story begins. Every account of humanity's first encounter with alcohol that you've ever seen, read, or heard has made one assumption so quietly that you probably didn't notice it, that the first taste was good. That whoever drank it recognized something pleasurable immediately, and that recognition is what set the chain of events in motion. It's a tidy story. It also skips the part that actually explains everything. Because the first taste of fermented liquid wasn't good. Not in any straightforward sensory sense. It was sour, probably cloudy, almost certainly carbonated in an unfamiliar way, and carrying a range of secondary fermentation byproducts that most modern palates would find actively unpleasant. The shock wasn't that it tasted wonderful. The shock was that it tasted wrong in a very specific way, and then something happened to the body of the person who drank it that no amount of taste aversion could fully override. What this video is about is that specific gap, the gap between the first terrible taste and the second deliberate drink. What happened in that space, neurologically, socially, psychologically, is one of the more revealing windows we have into how human beings actually make decisions. Not through rational evaluation, not through careful cost-benefit analysis, but through the collision of instinct and novel experience, mediated by the oldest and most powerful reward system in the mammalian brain. Understanding that gap tells you something about alcohol's relationship to human history. It also tells you something uncomfortable about how much of what we call preference and choice is actually just biology catching up to sensation. 4 things to work through. First, what that first taste actually was, the sensory reality, as close as modern science can reconstruct it. Second, why the body's response overrode the obvious signals that should have prevented a second drink. Third, who took that first drink, and why the identity of the first drinker matters more than the history of it usually acknowledges. And fourth, how the gap between bad taste and powerful effect became the engine that drove one of the most consequential behavioral shifts in the human story. Let's start with the taste itself, because reconstructing it is more possible than you might think, and the reconstruction is genuinely strange. Patrick McGovern's laboratory at the University of Pennsylvania has, over several decades of biomolecular archaeology, extracted chemical residues from ancient vessels across multiple continents and civilizations. The results paint a picture of early fermented beverages that are almost nothing like their modern descendants. The jiahu mixture from northern China, dated to roughly 7000 BCE, combined rice, honey, hawthorn fruit, and wild grape, a sweet-sour combination that would have tasted closer to a medicinal tonic than to any beer or wine currently on the market. The residues also showed evidence of tree resins and plant additives whose primary function, in many cases, was antimicrobial, preventing the growth of harmful bacteria in a fermentation environment that couldn't otherwise be controlled. Those resins would have made the drink bitter in a way that modern Western palates associate specifically with medicine. Which, as it turns out, is not an accident. For most of its early history, fermented liquid occupied a category that wasn't distinct from medicinal preparation. It was both. The line between a healing substance and an intoxicating one didn't exist yet, because nobody had the conceptual framework to draw it. Beyond the resin bitterness, early fermented beverages would have carried significant levels of acetaldehyde, a toxic byproduct of incomplete ethanol metabolism that exists in all fermented drinks but is present in higher concentrations in cruder preparations. Acetaldehyde is what produces the flushed face and racing heart of a hangover, and at the concentrations present in poorly controlled ancient ferments, it would have produced those effects during drinking rather than after. The first taste would have been accompanied by a warmth in the chest and face that had nothing pleasant about it. It would have felt closer to a mild fever response than to the smooth warmth we associate with a good drink. There's also the texture. Ancient fermented grain drinks were not filtered. They were thick, often containing suspended grain particles, yeast sediment, and the various plant matter that had been added to promote or flavor the fermentation. Drinking it without a straw, which is why so many ancient vessels were accompanied by long reed straws, particularly in Mesopotamian contexts, meant encountering a viscosity somewhere between thin porridge and murky water. Not a liquid you would choose for refreshment. And yet, underneath all of that, the sourness, the resin bitterness, the acetaldehyde warmth, the cloudy thickness, there was a sweetness. Not refined sugar sweetness, but the residual fermentable sugar sweetness of fruit and grain that the yeast hadn't yet fully consumed, combined with the primal olfactory signal of ethanol itself, which at low concentrations reads to the mammalian nose as fruity, almost floral. 10 million years of primate wiring recognize that signal. Not as pleasant, exactly. As significant. The first taste, in other words, was complicated. And complicated sensory experiences, ones that contain simultaneously off-putting and appealing elements, are precisely the kind of experiences that the human brain finds hardest to categorize and easiest to return to. Now for the part that actually explains the second drink. Because taste aversion, the powerful, protective mechanism that makes humans and most mammals avoid foods associated with nausea or discomfort, is not a weak force. It's one of the most durable forms of learned behavior the nervous system produces. You eat something that makes you sick once, and your body remembers for years. Sometimes decades. The evolutionary logic is obvious. Food that makes you feel bad is probably food that could kill you, and the memory of that association needs to be stronger than the memory of most other experiences to keep you alive. So why didn't taste aversion kick in after that first difficult mouthful of sour, resin-bitter, acetaldehyde-warm fermented liquid? The answer is timing. Taste aversion forms through a specific associative mechanism. The conditioned stimulus, the taste, the smell, the appearance of the food, has to be linked to the aversive outcome, the nausea, the discomfort, within a window of time that the brain can connect as cause and effect. That window is short for most learning associations. For taste aversion, it can be surprisingly long, hours rather than seconds, but the critical factor is that the aversive experience has to be clearly associated with the taste that preceded it. What ethanol produces in the body during and immediately after consumption, at low to moderate doses, is not aversion. It's the opposite. The GABA system activation, the dopamine release, the oxytocin surge, the reduction of the baseline threat assessment hum, all of these land in the system within minutes of consumption and produce a signal the brain categorizes as positive. Strongly positive. Memorably positive. The bad taste came first and the good feeling came second, and the brain's reward system, which is considerably more powerful than the aversion system in the short term, files the good feeling under outcome and the bad taste under acceptable cost. This is the specific neurological sleight of hand that made repeated alcohol consumption almost inevitable once the first encounter happened. The delay between the unpleasant stimulus and the rewarding outcome was long enough that they were processed as separate events, but short enough that the associative link between them formed strongly. Drink the sour liquid. Feel better shortly after. Remember where the sour liquid came from. Go back. The person who took that second drink wasn't overriding their survival instincts through some act of courage or recklessness. They were following their survival instincts, because their nervous system had correctly logged that the sour liquid in the clay vessel was associated with something it urgently wanted to experience again. The logic was impeccable. The mechanism was millions of years old. The context was completely unprecedented. Here's the question that the historical and archaeological record almost never asks: who, specifically, was the first person? Not the first culture, not the first civilization, not the first region. The first individual. What can we actually say about them? The honest answer is not much, but not nothing. And what we can say is stranger and more specific than the vague generic ancient human placeholder that usually fills this space. We can say with reasonable confidence that they were not elderly. The elderly in foraging and early agricultural societies were generally not the people testing unfamiliar foods. Their accumulated knowledge of what was safe was the group's collective memory, too valuable to risk on an unknown. The very young were similarly unlikely candidates for the obvious reason that children's access to communal food sources was typically managed by adults. This leaves a window: young adults, probably adolescent or in their early 20s, at the age when risk tolerance is biologically elevated and social status is still being established. There's a plausible argument that the first intentional drinker was someone of relatively low social status within their group. In foraging societies, testing unknown food sources, the functional role of the person who decides whether the new berry is poisonous before anyone else tries it, tends to fall to individuals whose loss would be less catastrophic to the group. Not because they were disposable in any cruel sense, but because the risk-reward calculus of food testing in uncertain environments had to be distributed somehow, and the people with least to lose from a bad outcome often bore the most exposure. If that's right, and it's necessarily speculative, but it's grounded in what we know about risk distribution in small group societies, then the person who first tasted fermented grain or fruit and triggered the chain of events that led to every wine glass, every temple offering, every Prohibition-era speakeasy, and every carefully cellared vintage was probably young, probably not the most powerful person in the group, and probably didn't experience what happened as a grand discovery. They experienced it as a test. A threshold. And they crossed it not because they knew what was on the other side, but because crossing thresholds is, in the risk tolerance window of early adulthood, what humans do. That specificity matters. Because it reframes the origin of one of humanity's most consequential behaviors from a heroic act of discovery into a very ordinary act of cautious curiosity performed by someone who had no idea what they were starting. Here's where the story gets complicated in a way that's easy to overlook. The gap between bad taste and good effect, the neurological sleight of hand described earlier, is not unique to alcohol. It's the basic architecture of acquired taste itself. Coffee is bitter in ways that most people find actively unpleasant on first encounter. Fermented foods of all kinds, kimchi, aged cheese, sourdough, fish sauce, carry flavor profiles that register as wrong to the uninitiated palate and then, through repeated exposure combined with positive contextual associations, become not just acceptable but actively craved. The process is the same: initial aversion, contextual positive outcome, repeated exposure, preference formation. What made alcohol's version of this process uniquely powerful was the directness and intensity of the positive outcome. Most acquired tastes work through social context. You learn to like coffee partly because coffee is associated with warmth, conversation, belonging, the specific pleasures of the morning routine. The positive outcome is diffuse and largely social. With alcohol, the positive outcome was neurological and immediate. The GABA system doesn't care about your social context. It responds to ethanol the same way in isolation as in company. That directness, the fact that the drink did something to the body that was unmistakable and immediate, made the acquired taste form faster and persist more stubbornly than almost any other substance the human system has encountered. Which is also, of course, precisely what makes alcohol's relationship with human biology so difficult to manage. The same mechanism that ensured repeated consumption after a bad first taste, immediate reward, strong associative memory, high dopamine signal, is the mechanism that sits at the foundation of alcohol use disorder. The biology doesn't distinguish between adaptive and maladaptive. It just reinforces outcomes. The first person who went back for a second drink set a neurological pattern that their descendants are still navigating, across every culture on Earth that has access to fermented beverages. The shocking moment wasn't the first taste. The shocking moment was the second. Come back to the clay vessel. The sour smell. The complicated expression on the face of the person who just tasted something that was wrong in a very specific way. Watch what happens next. They set the vessel down. They stand for a moment. The older woman who wanted to throw it out is watching them. The two people who stepped back are watching them. And then, after a pause long enough for the first flush of ethanol to reach the brain, the slight softening at the jaw, the almost imperceptible change in posture, the person who just tasted it picks up the vessel again. That second drink is the hinge point of the whole story. Not a grand moment. Not a discovery announced with any ceremony. Just a person going back to something that tasted bad because something in their body has just spoken much more loudly than their taste receptors, and the body's message was clear, whatever that was, it matters. What follows from that second drink, the eventual development of intentional fermentation, the embedding of fermented beverages in religious and social ritual, the agricultural decisions shaped by the desire for reliable access, the entire architecture of human drinking culture stretching from ancient Mesopotamia to your refrigerator. All of it is downstream of one ordinary person overriding an ordinary aversion response because their nervous system gave them a signal they didn't have the framework to ignore. We talk about human history as if it's driven by ideas, by leaders, by the decisions of powerful people in positions of authority. And sometimes it is. But sometimes the pivot point is a young adult with low social status and a moderately high risk tolerance, standing in front of a smelly clay vessel and reaching for it a second time because their brain told them something true that they couldn't yet put into words, that what was inside was worth the bad taste. That the cost was acceptable. That whatever happened after was better than whatever came before. The history of humanity is full of those moments. Most of them went unrecorded. This one changed everything, and nobody noticed. Before 1000 is built on the idea that the real story is almost never the obvious one, that the hinge points of human history are usually quiet, usually unrecorded, and usually located somewhere between biology and circumstance rather than at the foot of a monument. If that's the kind of history you want to spend time in, subscribe. And leave a comment with the question I keep coming back to: if the second drink is what actually changed everything, what other second choices in human history do you think are more important than the first ones? I have a list, and I want to see if yours overlaps.